Welcome, everyone. The Society of Actuaries is pleased to present this webcast, Review of Final RP-2014 and Scale MP-2014 Reports. What's changed, what's the same, and why? We're very pleased to welcome all of you to this program. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be your host for today's webcast. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and all participant lines will be muted during the event. If you need assistance at any time today, please send an email to soa@compartners.com. Today's presentation will last up to 90 minutes and does include time at the end for questions and answers. However, please feel free to enter a question for us at any time during today's presentation. To submit a question, simply type it into the chat box in the lower left corner of the window. Then be sure to click on the Send button located right next to the box. We'll also repeat these instructions later in the program. I'd also like to draw everyone's attention to the links box, also on the left side of your screen. To view or print the presentation slides, just click once on the presentation handout link. A separate web browser window will open and allow you to print them. We would like to remind you that the SOA adheres to a strict antitrust policy. For more information on the SOA's antitrust policy, please visit the SOA website. One final disclaimer, presentations are intended for educational purposes only and do not replace independent professional judgment. Statements of fact and opinions expressed are those of the participants individually and, unless expressly stated to the contrary, are not the opinion or position of the Society of Actuaries, its co-sponsors, or its committees. The Society of Actuaries does not endorse or approve and assumes no responsibility for the content, accuracy, or completeness of the information presented. Attendees should note that the sessions are audio recorded and may be published in various media, including print, audio, and video formats without further notice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Andy Peterson, who will introduce today's speakers. Andy, welcome to the program. You can go ahead and get started.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webcast today on the review of the final RP-2014 and Scale MP-2014 reports. I would like to thank the SOA Research Department for sponsoring the webcast today. My name is Andy Peterson. I'm a staff fellow at the SOA and have the pleasure of moderating today's events. As you all know, the SOA has just released the final reports of its latest study of pension plan mortality, the RP-2014 Mortality Table Reports and the Mortality Improvement Scale MP-2014 report. Today's webcast will be a review of the final pension plan mortality tables. Our speakers today are both members of the SOA's RPEC, Retirement Plans Experience Committee, and will provide an in-depth review of the final reports, including the key changes that have been incorporated to the reports in response to the comments that the SOA received during the report's exposure period. As we look at our agenda, Larry Pinzer will start with a discussion of the MP-2014 scale, and then Bill Roberts will cover the RP-2014 base tables. After that, we'll have time for questions from all of you as attendees. Note that our focus today is primarily on the reports and how we responded to the comments received. We know many actuaries have questions about implementation. We will try to answer as much as we can, but we're not in a position to conjecture about when or whether the IRS may implement these tables in regulation or what auditors may be requiring for accounting purposes. The primary SOA role in completing this project has been to put together the best objectively sound analysis of current and expected mortality experience for private sector pension plans in the U.S. With that said, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Larry Pinzer and Bill Roberts. Larry is a retired FSA. For the first 30 years of his actuarial career, Larry was a retirement consultant with Hewitt Associates, and more recently he's been working part-time on an actuarial R&D projects for Aon Hewitt. Larry has been a member of RPEC since 2009 and has served as a past chair. He's a fellow of the SOA. Bill Roberts is a senior consultant in the Cleveland office of Towers Watson. He has worked with Towers Watson for 29 years. He's a past member of the SOA's Education and Examination Committee and is currently chair of RPEC. Bill is a fellow of the SOA, an enrolled actuary, and a fellow of the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I just want to provide a couple more introductory remarks. As we look at the next slide, slide 5, this illustrates there's been a fairly extensive process in terms of completing these reports. We started with a data request in late 2009, and that from there went to many interim steps which included the release of Scale BB in 2012. Drafts of the reports, as you know, were exposed to the pension community for comment from February through May of this year, and after that comment period, RPEC and the SOA went through an in-depth review process of the comments. There were independent work review teams that assessed the work and the process that RPEC went through. Final reports and revisions were made, and on October 27th, as many of you will know, the SOA Board approved, and these tables were released publicly in final form. As I move to the next slide, I'm not going to cover the detail of this slide, but it just illustrates that there has been an extensive and what I would suggest is systematic process that was followed in creating these tables and reports. That process has been driven by a strong team of volunteers with assistance from Swiss Re and SOA staff support, and I'm very thankful for the work that all those folks have done. So that's it for introductory remarks. Let me turn it over to Larry to get to the substance of today's presentation. Larry, it's yours.
Thanks, Andy. We're going to start with Scale MP-2014, and then Bill will follow up with the base rates, RP-2014. So first, I thought it would be helpful to do a quick review of the exposure draft, which we have denoted as ED throughout this report. It's not the same ED that you see on the nightly news commercials. It's a different ED. So I'm hoping that by now, most of you on the phone, most of the U.S. pension actuaries on the phone are becoming more familiar with some of the basic concepts here. So we're going to go through this part pretty fast and then jump to what's changed and why. But first, let's go through it. Scale MP-2014 is a two-dimensional model that was based on a model that's been developed in the UK. It's the CMI. CMI stands for Continuous Mortality Investigation. It's a group that's supported by the IFOA in the UK. And over the past decade or so, they've developed this two-dimensional concept of mortality improvement. And what we've done here in our Scale MP-2014 in the exposure draft was patterned very much after that. There really are three basic concepts that you need to understand, or that was, upon which the new model was based. And that is that near-term mortality rates should look a lot like what's happened in the recent past. The second one is that long-term mortality improvement rates should be based on some expert opinion, and we know that there's a variety, there's a range of expert opinion out there, and we're going to go into that a little bit further in this discussion. And then finally, we have our near-term rates, we have our long-term rates. How do we get from the near-term to the long-term? It's based on some smooth transition. And the MP-2014 methodology included a certain transition. As you see in the bullets down below, the historic part, the near-term rates, was based on historical analysis of mortality trends based on Social Security data. The most current Social Security data that RPEC had at the time that the scale was created was through 2009. For some technical reasons, the actual graduation of that historical data was done through 2009, but if you're familiar with the concept of edge effects, we actually had a 2-year step back to 2007 as the starting point of the projection for MP-2014. And that 2007 is an important date, so just keep that in mind as we go through a number of these other topics throughout this report today. The other key aspect, the smoothing transition, was done through this concept called double cubic, which was, it's different what was done in the UK. We believe that it's a lot simpler. I know it sounds complicated, but it really isn't. The double cubic just means that there are cubic polynomials that interpolate between, one's on a horizontal basis and another on a diagonal basis, that interpolate through the transition period, and then you blend those horizontal and diagonal interpolations to come up with the final two-dimensional rates. Just to remind you once again, the long-term rates that we included in the original exposure draft, in essence, ended up at a flat 1% through age 85, and then there was a slight taper from 85 to 95, and then a further taper down to 0 between 95 and 115. So it is in essence 0 by the time you got to 115. I'm going to call that whole structure, when I say flat 1%, I mean that whole structure. So just be aware that there really is, it's not flat for every single age, but it's flat through age 85 for both males and females. The other thing that was inherent in the MP-2014 exposure draft was this convergence period concept of how long is the transition period. Transition period starts in 2007. We picked a 20-year transition period. We'll talk about what went into that. But that means that the long-term rates are fully transitioned by 2027, which is, at this point, about 12 years away. Let's keep on going then. So just to wrap up on the exposure draft, the scale MP-2014, we had some words in there about how the scale is supposed to be applied, and it was, and this is just quoting from the exposure draft, it was meant to be applied to all retirement programs in the U.S. It was meant to be applied to all of the RP-2014 base mortality rates, including those for disabled retirees, which is a fairly significant change, and that they should be applied generationally. We'll see how that changed. Any one of those points might have changed in the final report on the following pages. The other thing that I just want to point out is that the underlying model was designed to accommodate assumption sets other than what we're calling the committee-selected set of assumption sets, or the committee-selected assumption set that included that flat 1% long-term rate, the 20-year transition period, those types of things. The exposure draft clearly said you could use those alternative assumption sets for sensitivity analysis. Where it was less clear is whether you could actually, whether RPEC thought it was appropriate to use those alternate assumption sets for other purposes, like the actual measurement of pension plan obligations. We made that more clear in the final report. So let's go on. So that's a quick review of the exposure draft. And now we're going to go basically section by section of the scale MP-2014 response document. So there were a bunch of comments. We summarized what the comment was, what RPEC's response was, and then finally any changes. And you'll see that, for example, we have, I mentioned section 2 up here. That is the section, in each case we'll be pointing out which section this alludes to in the actual response to comments report. If you want more details, feel free to go in there and take a look. One thing you'll notice, I've distilled a bunch of comments. Like, for example, in this comment 2, I've basically said the exposure draft was too prescriptive, not enough consideration for professional judgment. Obviously, there were a number of comments, and each were phrased a little bit differently. If you want to see all the nuances, I suggest you go back to section 2 of the report, of the response document, and you can get a better flavor. But I've distilled a lot of these down to what I'll call the essence of what the comment was, and if you want more details, go back to the response document. So basically on this one, RPEC looked and thought about, looked at what we had done, saw the comments that we received, and ultimately we agreed that we were a little too prescriptive in the exposure draft. And so what we've done, we did make some changes to the final scale MP-2014 report. The big thing was sort of a structural change, and this was not, what was before. We had a sort of a model that the assumptions in the model itself were all combined. The big structural change here is now we're making a very clear distinction between the model itself and the assumption set that gets inputted into the model to come up with the 2D rates. By the way, the model itself now, we came up with a new name for it just because we felt we needed to, given that we've made this distinction. It's now RPEC_2014. So when you see that phrase, it means the underlying model for these two-dimensional mortality improvement rates. The assumption sets now, we have something that's can be either a user-selected set of assumptions or a committee-selected set of assumptions. and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The other thing we wanted to make clear is that this concept of an appropriately parameterized RP-2014 model. I know it's a mouthful, but that's a phrase that we used a lot in the final report, and basically saying that that you can, if you can justify a set of assumptions that you feel is appropriate for the application at hand, that could be appropriate for purposes other than just assessing sensitivities. It can be appropriate for measuring obligations. Now, once again, to the extent that you're using something that other than what the committee thought was the best estimate, there will probably be some justification required to make sure that you, the sponsor of the plan, and any auditors who are reviewing this are comfortable with the assumption set that you're using. So in general, there's going to be more of an onus, I believe, on the audit community if the user decides to use something other than the committee-selected assumption set. So here's sort of a pictorial of what we've done. In the exposure draft, everything was combined, the model and the assumptions. The model, for example, includes things like how we smooth Social Security Administration history of their, to come up with mortality improvement rates, the historical mortality improvement rates. It includes the double cubic concept of the interpolations. But the whole thing also, we had the assumptions sort of baked in there that came in, that produced the MP-2014 set of rates, two-dimensional. Now, I said, in parentheses, there was a clear opportunity to adjust those assumptions. The formulas in Appendix B allowed you to do that, but once again, it was not clear for purposes other than testing sensitivities that was an appropriate thing to do. So going to the final report, the model has changed. So now we've clearly separated the two concepts. We have the RP-2014 model, and then we have assumption sets that you plug in. If you plug in the committee-selected assumption set, lo and behold, you get scale MP-2014. If you plug in what we're calling now an alternate assumption set, something that the user selects, that produces another set of two-dimensional rates. And once again, if the user thinks that's more appropriate for the particular application at hand and can justify the use of those assumption sets, we're saying that that's perfectly okay for the user to do that. We want to let the user have that additional actuarial discretion. So now, moving on to the next comment. It was from summarized in Section 3. There was just a number of comments that said that the 2D structure was unnecessarily complex. This one we disagreed with. We still think that a 2D type of structure is necessary to capture all the things that is currently going on with mortality improvement in the United States right now. In general, you need a two-dimensional model that can reflect the current relatively high levels of mortality improvement and phase into something that is different, probably lower in the future, sometime in the future. To get from a current high level to something in the future that's at a lower level in most cases, you need to have a two-dimensional structure. You just can't do that quite as well by some sort of approximate one-dimensional structure, especially when we know that there are these cohort effects going on, year of birth cohort effects. I think the best example of the inadequacy of 1D models, or at least most 1D models, is you really don't have to look any further than Scale AA. Scale AA did a great job of locking in historical mortality improvement between the periods of 1977 and 1993. The problem is that the period from 1977 to 1993, when you lock those in, did not do a good job in picking up what happened in terms of mortality improvement for various cohorts where the mortality improvements changed if you just looked on a one-dimensional basis. So, there's just at this point, there's just a feeling that most 1D models are not going to be appropriate for the measurement of obligations, especially now that most valuation systems can handle two-dimensional mortality improvement. The other thing that's going on here is that, as many of you know, that there are much more complex longevity de-risking transactions going on these days. And to the extent that we really did need a much more robust model for mortality improvement in the United States as it related to the pension environment. I think if you think about it, if you're trying to settle a group of the baby boomers, we're a group that's had relatively low mortality improvement, for example, and compare that to settling a group of what I call the silent generation, those born in 1935 or around 1935, you're going to get two very different answers in terms of mortality improvement, but you only see that when you look at mortality improvement on a two-dimensional model. So, bottom line, we didn't make any changes. There were no changes to the final scale MP-2014 report based on this comment. We think that there is a necessity to look at mortality improvement in the United States on this two-dimensional basis to capture all the appropriate nuances. Now, having said that, I'm going to jump to section 4, where the paraphrased comment is, it would be nice to have a 1D model available, a 1D scale available, sort of like what RPEC did when we produced scale double B. If you remember, scale double B was actually based on a two-dimensional model, but then we converted that to a one-dimensional model for sort of a interim transition period. Where RPEC ended up on this one is that we said, yeah, okay, we understand that one-dimensional models can be developed, at least for and they're usually can work relatively well for short period of times, assuming that there are no major changes in the underlying interest rate environment. So, that's what the final report includes, is that we have actually developed a methodology to convert from a two-dimensional set of mortality tables to a one-dimensional table, but you need to plug in a bunch of, you need to know a bunch of things to start before you do that. First, you need a set of base mortality rates. You need to know what year you're looking at. 2014 is going to give you a different answer than if you looked at 2015 or 2020. You need to make some assumptions about the underlying interest rate structure. And you need to know what type of annuity you want to be dealing with. Do you want to be looking at straight life annuities? Do you want to be looking at deferred to 62 type of annuities? All these things are sort of inputs in terms of how you would come up with an appropriate 1D approximation for 2D. For a 2D table. Bottom line, and it's the bottom line of this particular slide, it turns out that using basic life contingency concepts, you can come up with a 1D approximation for a 2D table. And when you think about, for those of you who remember, it's really just a recursive process to come up with these 1D from a 2D. If you remember that there's these formulas that says if you've got an annuity at age 115, and you have an annuity at 114, you can back in, using V's and P's, you can back into what the right probability of death is to make that all work. And so it's just these basic life contingencies concepts, and we describe that in the final report. The other thing that's not on the slide here, but actually is in the on the SOA website, there is a tool that's been developed by one of the RPEC members that, given those inputs, those 4 inputs that I mentioned before, will actually take the 2D table and convert and produce this 1D version. So that's going to be helpful for those who still want to use a 1D. But once again, with the proviso that these things have go stale after a while, and you have to be careful how long you want to use them, and especially careful if the interest rate environment changes. The other important thing here is that we're still requiring, these 1D tables still require a generational projection. We have not done anything, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, we have not done anything that says we think that a static projection of any type is going to be a good approximation. These 1D tables that we're producing only work appropriately if you do a full generational projection of using that 1D scale. Now into section 5, and this is the concept of generational projection. I'll just say personally, I continue to be surprised or astounded at the amount of resistance that RPEC continues to see for the use of, for our recommendation of generational projection. And all I can say is that static projection is generally, in most situations, is going to be an inferior methodology than generational projection. In particular, generational projection, it's not only the professional standard used around the world right now, but there are certain key aspects of generational projection that just work way better than static projections. In particular, if you're looking at a particular subgroup of a population, and even subgroup of subgroup, I mean, it's not just looking at annuitants versus employees. If you're looking at annuitants in that silent generation versus annuitants in the baby boom generation, it's important to use a generational projection. Will get you what we believe is more appropriate results than any sort of static projection. Same thing for working over extended periods of time. If you're looking at not just pension costs now, but 5 years down the road and projections even beyond that, generational projection does that all appropriately, whereas you need to develop different static projections at different points in time. It just seems like a heck of a lot of extra work to do that type of analysis when generational handles it all appropriately. I mean, I don't want to beat this dead horse too much, but generational projection has been around for pension actuaries at least through GAR 94, so it's been around for 20 years now. And I've been told that it's been around for non-pension purposes even earlier than that. One would think that after 20 years, that U.S. pension actuaries would have learned and have gotten to the point where generational projection is the clearly acknowledged way to go in terms of how to project mortality in the future. So, needless to say, there are no changes in the final report based on that particular comment. Section 6. Now we get into some of the specific assumption-related type of comments that we got. This one in particular is on long-term rates. And the comments that we received for this one, actually it was interesting to see. We had a bunch of comments that said that our flat 1% was actually too high. Thought it was too high. I guess they were surprised also that some thought it was too low, that it should be higher. The other comment that I really haven't summarized here is that some comments basically said, we just want some flexibility. So just give us some flexibility and then we'll decide what we think is most appropriate, that we, the user, think is most appropriate. So this is one that's clearly quite subjective. Experts from lots of different fields will disagree on what the long-term rate of assumption is going to be. There are some, and I'll point to Social Security, that generally speaking has assumed rates somewhat lower than 1%, and yet not entirely, not for every age category. I'm going to come back to that for a second. That Social Security has something across, if you look at their sort of age-adjusted mortality improvement rate for a long term, it's about probably, I would say, around 0.8% compared to RPEC's 1% number. And yet you look at other sources, the Congressional Budget Office, in their 2013 long-term budget outlook, had a very interesting piece. They ended up at 1.17% long-term rate, and I would encourage anybody who wants to know more about that. There's in that 2013 long-term budget outlook, which is cited, by the way, in the final MP-2014 report. There's a section in there that says why CBO changed its approach to projecting mortality. they had used Social Security before 2013, and in 2013 they switched to something higher than Social Security. So I just wanted to point that one out. The technical panel of Social Security Advisory Board, which is independent from Social Security. This is a group that reviews the Social Security assumptions every 4 years. Back in 2007 suggested, in essence, a flat 1%, and the 2011 technical panel suggested something even a little higher than that. So what RPEC tried to do is balance all of this competing input. And we, in the end, thought that 1% represented that well-balanced assimilation from all the various factors that potentially could influence mortality patterns in the U.S. I do want to go back for 1 second, and I just want to point out about where Social Security is. Social Security and I'm just going to focus on the rates that are most important to pension actuaries. The Social Security age-adjusted long-term rate for ages 50 to 64 is actually 1.1%. It's actually higher than what RPEC has assumed. For the 65 to 84 age category, Social Security assumes 0.88% for their age-adjusted central death rate long-term. So I would say that 0.88% is not too far away from the 1%. Where the biggest difference is in the 85 plus category. Social Security assumes 0.55% for the 85 plus category, which is, now 85 just happens to be also the age at which RPEC rate starts to trend down. But Social Security still ends up being a lower number than what RPEC has assumed. But I just wanted to point out a couple of things, that up until age 85, Social Security assumptions are not always lower than what RPEC assumed, and especially in that 50 to 64 category. So it was just interesting to me. Those who are, a number of commenters said, why didn't we pay more attention to what Social Security did, or give more credit to it? And I think we did, but it was part of the balanced approach that we took. So finally, what were the changes? We actually, we have our generally less prescriptive language, so we think we now have allowed users to come up with their own long-term rates. The other thing that we included in the final Scale MP-2014 report, we put sensitivity analysis for other alternate long-term rates. In particular, one set of rates looked at, in essence, 75% of the committee-selected long-term rate. So 75% of 1% is 0.75, a flat 0.75, at which tapered at the end. Another one was 1.25% of what committee-selected rates were that tapered off. So in essence, we dropped it by 25 percentage point, or 25%, and then increased it by 25%. And we have those changes and what the impact of those changes are on, in terms of annuity values when used in conjunction with the RP-2014 base rates. And for those of you who looked at that, I think you might be underwhelmed in terms of what the impact is. I think many people might have thought that the impact of changing the long-term rate may have had a bigger impact. But if you look at those particular numbers, they are not as sensitive as you might have otherwise thought. And in fact, that's very consistent with what the type of analysis that CMI did when they looked at a similar situation in the UK. So now into comment 7. And this one has to do with the convergence periods. Remember the CMI that the RPEC had assumed that a 20-year convergence period for both our cohort effects and our age period effects. Some thought, once again, there were comments on both sides. Some thought they should be as long as 30 years. Others thought that they should be much shorter. we looked at this quite a bit when we were developing these tables, and ultimately thought that 20 years was the sweet spot here, that getting much longer than 20 years. Remember, it's 20 years from 2007. That's the key here. It's not 20 years from 2014. It's 20 years from 2007, so that the full phase-in is done by 2027. So once again, what were the changes? There was, once again, we have this generally less prescriptive language that says if you have a good rationale for changing the convergence period, and you can justify that and convince your plan sponsor and the auditor that that's appropriate, that's perfectly fine now. The one thing that RPIC is warning against is what we call excessively short convergence periods. And it's a little cryptic what we've written here in this, could inappropriately dilute the near-term mortality improvement trends. And what do we really mean there? And I think the best thing is an example. One commenter said that they think we should be using a 10-year convergence period. So the example here, if someone used a 10-year convergence period, if you go 10 years from 2007, you're fully phased in by 2017. So if you're doing a 2015 valuation, or year in 2014, in essence, you've got 2 years of these other things that are going on, period effects and cohort effects and all that other stuff, and then you're at a flat 1%. We just think that's unrealistic. You really, given that cohort effects now have persisted for over 30 years now, to assume that they're going to disappear in 2 years just didn't seem right to RPEC. And I could say the same thing for even a 15-year convergence period is, in my mind, personally speaking, feels excessively short. We think that 20 years is probably the right level for a convergence period. If you start going much beyond 20 years, it sort of has a less of an impact just because you start, it's really the first 15 years or so of the convergence period that really has the biggest impact. So those were the changes, once again, for convergence periods. More flexibility, but this admonition that don't go excessively short, because we think that's not going to be capturing enough of the cohort effects that we think really are going to take place. Section 8 now. This, by the way, is a comment that we've included. This has responded to this in both the MP report and in the RP, the base table report. And you may question, what the comment was is that someone said we should show the mortality rates of 2006. That's the central year of our final data set. And you might be asking yourself, what does that have to do with scale MP-2014 and with the mortality improvement scale? Well, the bottom line is that to get from 2006 essential year to 2014, RPIC used the MP-2014 mortality improvement rates to get from 2006 to 2014 to 2014. So to the extent that we now have made it clear about the use of these alternate assumption sets, some might say, well, I don't really want my RP-2014 base rates to have baked into it the MP-2014 rates between the periods 2006 and 2014. And so this particular commenter said, well, how about if we just show mortality rates as of 2006? What RPEC said is all pension mortality tables that we're used to, GAR 94, UP 94, RP 2000, they were all based on data sets with earlier central years, but then were adjusted somehow to the as-of date, the release date of the table. And we did not want to break that tradition. The only thing that's different here is that that this is the first time that the projection that we used actually is based on a mortality projection scale that could be varied if you want to vary it now with an alternate assumption set. So there was a change to the final scale MP-2014 report that that we wanted to include just to accommodate that situation, a possible situation. It's called, it's a new terminology. It's called factoring out methodology, and it just means that you can take the scale MP-2014 rates for years 2007 through 2014. There are 8 mortality improvement rates in that period of time. You can multiply those out, and you can essentially factor out that mortality improvement from the 2014 rates and get back to 2006. So if you wanted to get back to 2006, there's a way to do it. We thought it still made sense to maintain 2014 in the title of the table and keep the base set of mortality rates in a 2014 as of date. If you want to go back and sort of reconstruct what the rates looked like back in 2006, you can do that. There's a bit of an issue between first graduating and then projecting versus first projecting and graduating. RPIC checked on that nuance, and the difference is minuscule. So you get very, very close to the appropriate 2006 starting point using this factoring out methodology. Finally, we're on Section 9. This is the last section, and I'll just mention that Section 9 included a whole bunch of different comments. This is sort of the potpourri, the various comments that didn't neatly fit into any of these other categories very nicely. I picked one of them, and this is one just because I think there was a misunderstanding. People who read the papers, both the RP-2014 and the scale MP-2014, might have gotten mixed up at some point. So I just wanted to clarify this. And this has to do with what many commenters claimed to be was an inconsistent use of public plan data. The fact that, and the inconsistent use was that, and Bill's going to talk about this in a few seconds, in RP-2014 base rates, the data set excluded public plan data. We collected public plan data, but we ended up excluding it for base rates. However, we did use that public plan data for purposes of helping basically verify that mortality improvement trends in the U.S. for these pension plans was consistent with what we were seeing from the SSA data. And so there were 2 completely different uses for the public plan data. One was one was on a base mortality rate basis, and when we looked at base mortality rates, that's where, and Bill will be talking about this, this is where we said it's different enough, the base rates were different enough that we didn't feel comfortable, it wasn't appropriate at the time to combine those with the private plan data. However, in terms of getting the general shape of mortality improvement in pension plans, once again, to get mortality improvement rates, you need a long set of consistent mortality improvement rates. You need a long consistent set of data. It has to be over a long period of time, and it has to be a consistent block of information. And the only way we had an opportunity to do that with the U.S. pension plans, we being RPEC, was through the public plan data we got. We got public plan data not just for the 5-year observation period, but very often for a 15-year period. A much longer period of time, consistent information, and we wanted to sort of test the premise that that the pension plan mortality improvement was not dissimilar from what we saw in the Social Security mortality data. And that's the way we did it. We did it by looking at public plan mortality improvement. So for those, once again, I think it was just a confusion. It's in one case we excluded it for the base mortality tables, but in terms of just verifying that mortality improvement seemed to be matching up with Social Security, that's where we ended up sort of using the public plan as sort of that double check that we were at least doing, that it was not inconsistent with what we were seeing in terms of mortality improvement from the Social Security data. So on this one, there was no changes in the MP-2014 report. So finally, just a quick summary. So those are, once again, there are way more detail, obviously, in the comment response document, and you feel free to go through that. So in summary, the scale MP-2014 rates are the same in the final reports as they were in the exposure draft. And the committee-selected assumptions still remain RPEC's best estimate. But now we've got this new structure. We've got a model, RPEC_2014, and we've got assumption sets, which are either user-selected or committee-selected. And hopefully now that user-selected provides enough flexibility so that actuaries who want to use their professional judgment can do so. 1D rates are available, but with some provisos, and say especially there's sort of should be a shelf life to these things, especially if there are changes in the interest rate environment. And then, to the dismay of many, I know, but we still feel very strongly that generational projection is the way to go. And I would encourage all of you out there who are still clinging on to static projection to essentially get over it, move to generational. It's just a better way to do things. I am going to finish with one sort of, I call this just a reminder slide, plus a break from a lot of words in my section to a lot of words in the upcoming section. Just to remind you, these are the heat maps for MP-2014. There are just so many interesting things here. If you haven't gotten used to seeing what's going on here, I encourage you to try to spend some time and do that. This is what I call Medicare Ridge. Medicare came in 1965, and 10 years later, there's this very strong period effect of improved mortality at basically all ages up and down. So I call that Medicare Ridge. There's this dashed dot black line that you see. Let me get a little closer here. Dashed dot black line, this represents the silent generation born in 1935. This has had that very strong period of high levels, relatively high levels of mortality improvement, whereas if you look here, this diagonal along is what I call baby boom valley, where the baby boomers are showing relatively low periods, in fact some negative periods of mortality improvement. So try to get more comfortable if you haven't yet. This is actually a great slide to understand the dynamics of two-dimensional mortality and why we think two-dimensional mortality is the way to go here. With that, I'm going to pass it on to my friend Bill Roberts.
Okay, thank you very much, Larry. So now we'll turn our attention to the RP-2014 mortality tables, the base mortality tables. And as Larry did, I want to start with an overview of the exposure draft, sort of a description of the process. The study started in 2009 with scoping out of what we hope to accomplish and putting together the data request and collecting the data. And then in early February of this year, the exposure draft was published. And the exposure draft results were based on 10.5 million life years of exposure from uninsured private pension plan data. And as Larry mentioned, we collected a lot of additional data, in particular for public plans, but for reasons that we'll discuss in a few minutes, we decided to focus on the uninsured private pension plan data. And from the data, we created a number of different tables. First, we, as was done in the RP-2000 study, we produced separate annuitant and employee tables to capture the significant mortality experience that's observed between those groups. And we also came up with blue and white collar tables, and in this case we also came up with separate employee and annuitant tables by collar. And we also produced top and bottom quartile tables to capture differences between people who are receiving high benefits or people whose benefits or pay are lower, and that's to reflect the understanding that there's a pretty strong correlation between high benefit amounts and longevity. And we also produced mortality table for disabled retirees. Now, after the exposure draft, we had a comment period that lasted from the release of the exposure drafts until the end of May, and received a number of interesting comments, and including a number of people who questioned the omission of the public plan data from the standpoint of what did that signify as far as public plans go, as well as what impact would the public plan data have had if it had been included, and including the question of whether the results might somehow be biased through the emission of the public plan data. So just wanted to go through the response document. This is section 2 of the RP-2014 response document, and it presents the rationale for the exclusion of the public plan data. And when we looked at the public plan data and what it suggested and how it compared with the uninsured private plan data, first we saw that the differences between male and female mortality rates were much less in the public plan data than in the private plan data. And we also saw that that there was less difference in mortality based on amount. So less correlation between longevity and high benefit amount in the public plan data. In addition, it's just that there was no color distinction provided with the public plan data, so we could not divide the public plan data into blue collar and white collar, and also we would not be able to, if we'd included the public plan data, we couldn't describe, how much of the data set was comprised of a particular collar's data. And also, there were significant differences in mortality patterns below age 65 between public and private plan data. And in addition, when the study was done, the mortality study was done as a successor to RP-2000, and also was prompted by some provisions in PPA where PPA says that at least every 10 years, the Secretary of the Treasury is to revisit the mortality assumptions that are used under Section 430 for single employer plan valuations. And we had hoped that we would be able to provide something that would that the Secretary of the Treasury might consider as they revisit the mortality question. And so we thought that given the plans to which Section 430 applies, we thought that the uninsured private plan data would be a better fit. Okay. Now we also, again, we've kind of gone through some of the responses and why we made the decision we did. And sorry I did not get to talk about it before I got to the slide. Another comment, in addition to the reasons for excluding the data, was if you excluded the public plan data, what does that mean for public plans? Does that mean that the RP-2014 mortality tables aren't appropriate for public plans? And we wanted to emphasize that that's not the case. That in particular, if you have a lot of public plans have been using RP-2000, and they may well want to consider RP-2014, and it wouldn't necessarily be inappropriate for a public plan to use RP-2014. And certainly, they might want to take a look at their experience, if they have a sufficient experience to be credible, and see if RP-2014 is a good fit. So we certainly didn't mean to imply by the omission of the public plan data that somehow that meant that public plans shouldn't use RP-2014. Another area that that's Section 2. Section 3 concerns another area that a number of commenters mentioned, which was they questioned why PBGC data weren't collected and used in the study. And so I wanted to spend a couple of minutes, and this is again in the response document, talking about that. And we did, as part of the process, make a request to PBGC for the data, but we knew that the PBGC data was not used in the RP-2000 study, and so when we did not get a response, that wasn't particularly surprising. And so there wasn't a lot of follow-up. So it ended up that we did not get data. But we also, in addition, had some concerns about how PBGC data might differ from others. In particular, because the plans are terminated and trusteed by the PBGC, there may be mortality differences in the plans because it may be the case that maybe the requirement to separate from service to receive the benefit may be different. People may, if the company disappeared, people may have had to start the benefit early for economic reasons. There were just a number of reasons why we thought that the pattern of retirement would be could be significantly different in the PBGC plans than in other ongoing plans. And in addition to that, the PBGC has no reason to and do not maintain anything in their data that indicates what the collar would be of the covered population. And so we would not, that would not be part of what they could provide. So there were a number of reasons why we thought that we would have maybe a more reliable, better product without the PBGC data. Now we are working with PBGC to see if we can collect the data from them, and if we are ultimately successful, we anticipate that we would produce a separate mortality study just based on the PBGC data. But we did not make any changes to the RP-2014 report on this issue. Now, more broadly, concerns were expressed in general about the inclusion-exclusion process, because we did collect quite a bit of data. Somewhere near 40, a little over, I think, 49 million life years of data was received altogether, and we ended up using about 10.5 million. So a number of commenters said that the yield on the data received was very low. But as we've mentioned, one of the big exclusions, about 29 million of those life years of data was for public plans, which we decided to exclude for the reasons we've already discussed. And then after that, there were some submissions. One of the submitters, we had a submitter that that gave us about 6.7 million life years of data, but provided no consistent ID that would allow us to tie a participant's records together across the span of the study. And we did try to work with the submitter to see if we could get something like that, some kind of ID that would allow us to put together these consolidated records, but that was not successful. So about 6.7 million life years of data were dropped for that reason. And we also had another submitter that had some dates of death that were very questionable, in fact, obviously wrong, and we discussed that with the submitter, and the submitter made another attempt to handle the issue but was unsuccessful, so ultimately we had to leave that data behind as well. And we also got data where the ages were, we did, as we mentioned in the report, we looked at what we considered sort of typical or reasonable ages for annuitants, reasonable ages for employees, and occasionally we got a few records that indicated ages that were for annuitants or employees that were outside of those ranges, and so we did drop those records because there just wouldn't have been enough data at those ages to be meaningful. So we ended up, after those kinds of drops, we ended up with about 12.9 million life years of data, and then we did something that we called the A over E analysis. A over E is actual deaths compared to expected deaths. So we looked for a plan's actual deaths, a reasonable basis for actual deaths versus we took the actual deaths to a reasonable estimate of what we thought the deaths should end up to be, just to see if there were any wildly out of line A over E ratios. And if we did find a plan that had an A over E ratio that seemed out of line, and unless the plan was quite small, we contacted the submitter and asked for confirmation as to whether the data were correct or whether they thought there were any corrections needed. And ultimately, we did omit about 2 million life years of data for that reason, and ended up with the 10.5 million life years that on which the study was based. Okay. Also wanted to point out that when it came to issues with the data like inconsistent, we mentioned inconsistent gender or dates of death showing up multiple times, different dates with different records for the same person. And we discussed those things in the report, but did want to point out that we did not make the decision to exclude data on a record-by-record basis. It was done only on a plan-wide basis, just to make sure that we didn't bias the data by these kinds of exclusions. So, we think that the data process was good, and the result was a good set of data, and would allow us to appropriately calculate the exposures for the individuals that were included in the study, and properly determine the right number of deaths and put together a good product. And we do, though, did think that the exposure draft and the language in the exposure draft did not do a very good job of explaining the data process, or at least didn't do as good of a job as what we would have liked. And so you will see in the RP-2014 final report substantially revised description of the data collection and validation process that was used in the study. As with MP-2014, we've received a number of comments that said that the language in the exposure draft was too restrictive. Particularly, there was language that said that we recommended that the RP-2014 tables be used to value all pension plans in the U.S. And the commenters thought that they should have more latitude to pick the assumption that was appropriate for the plan that they were looking at. And we also received, again, similar to the public plan data, we received comments that said that the public plan actuaries would appreciate some direction on the use of the tables. And we did agree that the ED language was too restrictive, and we did change it to make it clear that actuaries should have the flexibility to pick the right table for the plan, of course. And we introduced the concept of the RP-2014 tables as benchmarks, that we recommend them for consideration. And if you're doing experience studies or credibility studies, that the RP-2014 tables would be candidates that could be considered for performing those kinds of analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the use of the RP-2014 tables by public plans, we certainly don't think there's any problem with that if the experience of the plan suggests that RP-2014 is a good fit. Section 6 deals with the question of combined tables. As I mentioned, we did produce separate employee and annuitant tables pretty much everywhere except for disability, where we only have retirees. And a number of people said that they would like a combined table or some instruction of how to create a combined table. And the issue here is that we think that the difference between the proportion of the population that's annuitants versus employees at those ages where there's an overlap between employees and annuitants is going to vary quite a bit from plan to plan. And it really, we were very loath to put together a combined table out of the concern that it may be inappropriate for a number of people who might want to use a combined table. So we do think that given where systems are, that probably most people would be able to use the separate employee and annuitant tables. But if it's necessary to create a combined table, we did changed in the final report, we changed the process that we suggest be considered to put together a combined table to say that you should look at the proportion of your population that is retired versus employed at sort of that overlap between the annuitants and the employee ages, and take that into account when you're deciding what mortality rates should apply during that overlap period. But again, as Larry mentioned, when it comes, a weakness with combined tables is when you start looking at subsets of your plan's population, because if you're looking at all the employees who are between ages 50 and 65 for whatever reason, the combined table that you've created that includes consideration of all your annuitant population may not be appropriate for measuring just the employees in that age group. So we do think that the better procedure would be to use separate annuitant and employee tables if that's at all possible. We also had a number of people who said that our comparison of the cost effects of the new tables to old tables would be improved if we included some of the tables that are more widely used, in particular for PPA, for minimum funding. A comparison of the new tables to the PPA static projection tables would be more useful. And we did add some new comparisons to the response document. And so you will be able to see some additional factors there that may be helpful. And we also, in the final report, we did change the presentation there a little bit to show what if we took RP-2000 and projected it with MP-2014 and compared that result to RP-2014, we thought that would be an interesting result for people to see, because it does emphasize the point that if you take RP-2000 mortality rates and project them to 2014 with the MP-2014 scale, you do end up with mortality rates that are quite similar to the RP-2014 table rates. Another comment concerned the suggestion, or the recommendation, actually, in the ED and in the final report, that disabled mortality rates be projected on a generational basis. The comment was that is a big change from the way things have been done in the past, because in many, many cases, this disabled mortality is not projected. It's just kept static at whatever table has been selected to measure disability mortality. But we mentioned the rationale for recommending the projection is that, number one, the Social Security Administration has said that when they look at their subset of data that relates to disabled lives, that they're seeing very similar rates of mortality improvement for disabled lives as what they're seeing overall. So that was a big driver for that recommendation, as well as the observation that when we looked at, again, the RP-2000 disabled mortality rates and compared those to the new RP-2014 disabled mortality rates, if we took those RP-2000 rates and project them with RP-2014, we get rates that are very similar to the RP-2014 disabled rates. And so those factors combined just confirmed the conclusion that we think that it would be a recommendation to apply generational mortality to the disabled lives as well. And I would just point out, just as an aside, that at least my personal understanding of the actual standards of practice is that if you are not projecting mortality improvement for disabled lives, that needs to be mentioned in your reports. Okay, another comment here, and I think given the time, maybe we'll, I think this is, well, I think we're right here at the end, which is good, because I think we're just about the time we want to turn it over to questions. But another question, this is an interesting point, was, is the fact that plans are paying more lump sums causing mortality tables to be biased? And if you think about that, the point is that someone whose health is not good would probably be much more likely to select a lump sum than an annuity if they had that choice from their plan. And what that would mean is that perhaps we would see people who wouldn't live as long selecting a lump sum, and people who are very healthy and have a family history that might suggest they're going to live to a very old age would be more likely to choose the annuity form of payment. And so we can understand the basis for the question, but the fact is that the data that we reflected the data we had in an unbiased way. And sure, if there are people who got a lump sum, they aren't going to be in the data because no one, I'm not aware of anyone who keeps the lump sum people around, unless maybe for post-retirement medical or another plan. But for the most part, people who receive the lump sum aren't in the data anymore, and they aren't in our data either. But the people who take the annuities are there, and for annuity-only plans, everybody is going to be in the data. So I think we did accurately reflect the lives in the data. Now, if you do have a plan that pays annuities only, you might think, well, the fact that, if you've got a table that reflects a lot of plans that pay a lot of lump sums, you might think, well, there might be a bias from my perspective, the perspective of my plan that pays only annuities, because this table has some less healthy lives removed, where my plan doesn't. Those unhealthy lives have no choice but to take the annuity, and that's certainly a point well taken, and that's something to consider when you're looking at your experience for a plan like that. Conversely, if you have a plan that is one of the plans that is paying the lump sum, that is also something you should keep in mind when considering the experience for a lump sum paying plan. If you're paying a lot of lump sums, the people who are deciding to take annuities may be people who are very healthy and do have that family history of very long lives, and maybe should be valued with a more conservative mortality table. And so we did not make any changes in the final report in this area. Just by way of summary, the mortality tables that are in the RP-2014 final report are the same as what appeared in the exposure draft, so there are no changes there. And we did introduce the concept of the RP-2014 tables as benchmark tables to compare experience to, and they could certainly be selected on their own or used for credibility studies to come up with the appropriate mortality rates for a particular plan. And the final report, again, recommends consideration of the new tables, which I think is an appropriate change in the language around the recommended use. And we also included some informal guidance on public plans, and certainly it is not just it's not inappropriate for a public plan to consider using an RP-2014 table for their valuations. So with that, I'm going to pass control back to Jennifer for the Q&A portion of today's webcast.
Great. Thank you very much. It is now officially time for the question and answer segment. Remember, to ask a question, simply type it in the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and be sure to click on send. We'll read the questions out loud and respond so that everyone may hear them. If you're listening to the audio only and do not have access to the chat box, please feel free to submit your questions to soa@compartners.com. Andy, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of questions out there already, a lot of good questions. So we'll see how many we can knock off in the next 15 minutes, and then go from there. Just an initial question. Larry, there was discussion about this RPEC 2014 model and alternative assumption sets. Is there any assistance the SOA is going to provide if people want to develop these alternative tables or assumption sets, I guess?
Yeah, actually, so as we speak, one of the RPEC members is developing a spreadsheet-based tool that would enable a user to pick the long-term rate, so it's a set of long-term rates, obviously, for each age, convergence periods, and actually the blending of horizontal and diagonal that would then create the two-dimensional model. So this is in addition to the model that's already out there. Sorry, the tool there's already a tool out there that does the 2D to 1D conversion. This would be a secondary tool or another tool that would be available for users to plug in their own alternate assumption set and, without having to go through the gory details of the double cubic methodology, will actually do all that for you and produce the two-dimensional set of mortality, the 2D mortality improvement rates. So that's in the works. We're hoping in the next couple of weeks that would be available. And once it's been fully tested, it would be made, the plan is to have that available on the SOA website, right by where you read the MP-2014 reports and the Excel spreadsheet that includes all the factors. We would have that tool available as well.
Good. So there are a couple questions that, and I know I touched on this in the beginning, but the sort of what the IRS will do. And I think the quick answer to simply say when the IRS might prescribe this, we, as the SOA and RPEC, have been in contact with and informing, I guess would be the proper way, informing the regulators, the IRS actuaries, PBGC, and so on, of our progress throughout this study, particularly in the last couple years as we got close to completion. But the IRS told us effectively that until the tables were released in final form, that they were not going to do anything with them. So until this last release as of a week ago, they were not going to do anything. So presumably the IRS is now looking at this, or will be soon, and it's up to them from a policy standpoint on what point they decide to, and if they decide to prescribe these tables for use in minimum funding and 417E calculations in a U.S. context. The earliest that can happen, obviously, since they've already released 2014 and 15 rates, would be for 2016, but whether they would be able to do that or not is a discussion that they'll have to address, and that's not something that we at the SOA can address. Bill or Larry, anything else you want to address sort of from the regulatory aspects?
No, I think really. We don't have any. We don't have any special knowledge about that, or no reason to have any.
Yeah. Okay. There are several questions about scale BB, and one was just an initial question of could one use scale BB with RP-2014? I don't know which of you would like to address that one.
I think you could. I mean, once again, it all comes down to what you think is most appropriate for the particular application at hand. I guess I would say, especially now that there are, if the reason why you're using scale BB is because it's one-dimensional, I don't know why you would use the one-dimensional scale that's 2 years old now instead of a one-dimensional scale that you could develop using the MP-2014 methodology. So to the extent that one-dimensional scales are now available, not necessarily recommended, but available under MP-24, why wouldn't you use that instead of scale BB? That's what I would say.
So what about, does RPEC have a view on whether MP-2014, or what makes MP-2014 better than, say, the BB-2D that was released in conjunction with the scale BB?
Well, if nothing else, it's based on 2 more years of mortality data from the Social Security Administration. So It's based on more up-to-date information. The methodology is different, but not totally dissimilar. The other thing that, so for better or for worse, the other major difference between scale BB and what I'll call RPEC_2014 is the 20-year convergence period, or MP-2014. The scale BB actually had a slightly smaller, slightly shorter convergence period built in for things like cohort effects. So I would say that the biggest difference is the fact that we've incorporated another 2 years of Social Security mortality data into our MP-2014 projection scale. Plus, I guess one other thing, scale BB actually was slightly scaled back from the underlying two-dimensional scale that we developed at the time. It was called BB2D. We didn't want to overshoot. Given that scale BB was meant to be an interim scale, the one thing we didn't want to do was to project mortality too far, and then when we published the final report, have to scale things back. So we purposely understated mortality improvement a little bit in scale BB. So I think all of those things go to say that we would, I think everyone in RPEC, speaking for myself especially, I don't see if the only reason why you would use BB now is for the one-dimensional aspect of that. I think you have a much better alternative in the one-dimensional versions of MP-2014 now available.
Yeah, so that's an important point to stress that I think wasn't clear, at least in some of the questions. Scale BB was always released as an interim scale because RPEC saw that scale AA wasn't doing a good job. They wanted to get something out for actuaries to use in the interim until this final report was released. So it was always released as an interim sort of temporary scale. Is that correct, Larry and Bill?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And in fact, somewhere in the MP-2014 report, we say the intention is that the MP-2014 scale and the RPEC_2014 methodology is meant to replace both scale AA and scale BB. To the extent that scale BB has a little bit more of a shelf life just because people might have just adopted it recently and sort of as a transition to MP-2014, that's up to, between the actuary and the sponsor and the auditor in terms of whether they think that's appropriate. My recommendation would be just go to MP-2014 now.
So, Bill, there's a series of questions about the public plan data and why it was excluded or not, and you certainly addressed aspects of that. But then the question, I guess, is if it truly was excluded, then why would it be appropriate to use RP-2014 as a mortality basis for a public plan?
Well, the public plan data collected first was for three very large plans, but just 3 plans. And when we looked at those 3 plans, we found that their mortality patterns were distinct from each other, as well as from the private plan data. And so they're just different from the uninsured pension plan data. Now, if you are an actuary for a public plan that's large enough to have credible mortality experience, and you want to compare your results to RP-2014, and suppose the results of that analysis shows that RP-2014 is a good fit for the mortality experience that you've observed, then as with any other plan, it certainly would be entirely appropriate to use RP-2014 as your evaluation mortality table.
And it's probably worth noting that RP-2000 didn't have any public plan data in it either, right?
Right, exactly. Yep.
And
go
Go ahead, Larry.
No, yeah, and exactly. RP-2000 did not include any public plan data, and yet it is widely used by public plans today, probably because there just isn't a very good alternative out there that is specifically for public plans. And I'll just mention that if you've read the documents out there, RPEC, that is probably one of the next items on RPEC's longer-term scale project list. The most important study would be to undertake a similar study focusing on public plans, especially, and we think, for example, that we would be doing something separately for public safety versus teachers versus other public entities. So we understand that it would be great to have some other benchmark available for public plans, specifically based on public plan data. But until that comes around, that study is performed, I really do believe that if you're looking for a benchmark and you're looking for a more current benchmark than RP-2000, that the first place I'd be looking is RP-2014 and looking to see if one of those tables is an appropriate basis, matches reasonably well based on the actual public plans experience. The one thing I would caution, once again, and we say this in the report as well, there are a lot of, you need to be very careful, for example, just jumping to a blue-collar table for public plans just because your public plan is unionized. We would think that there are lots of very healthy populations out there of unionized public plan employees. So it may be that, as we said, we caution just looking at the union status or bargaining status of a public plan to automatically jump to a white or a blue-collar table. You need to be a little bit more careful there.
So, and related to the whole idea of a public plan study, another possible cut could be looking at geography, and there was a question about whether that was done in this study, and I believe the answer is no, simply because we didn't have that level of detail in the data provided to us. I will say that. Yeah, go ahead.
Andy. It's difficult to do a geographic study because if you have a lot, now maybe public plans might be the ideal candidate for this because a lot of public plans are geographically centered in different states. Now, with big organizations that might have facilities across the country, it's really you need to get data on where each participant is in order to have some estimate of geography. It's knowing where the organization's headquartered isn't that important if there's only 100 people at headquarters and 100,000 people across the country somewhere else. And so geography can be, I think it would be an interesting study if we could get some assessment of how mortality differs by geography, but it's not a simple thing to do. And maybe public plans may be a little easier.
Yeah, public plans seems to be the place to do that. And just to acknowledge, it says the dust is still settling from this study with respect to, it's just gotten out the door, but it is certainly something that the SOA will be looking at. And in relation to that, what's the expectation of looking at mortality improvement on a more frequent basis?
Well, right now the expectation is every 3 years is what we thought was appropriate. I think that's just something that we want to keep monitoring. If for whatever reason we think it should be done more frequently or less frequently, we're going to keep an eye on that. I think 3 years seems like a good duration or a good separation to me. I think there probably would not be enough change on an annual basis to do it. At least that's my opinion. That for example, I think there might be pressure for pension actuaries if the SOA were to come out with a new table every single year, which is by the way what CMI does, by the way. If we came up with a new mortality improvement scale each year, there would be very small tweaks, ongoing tweaks to the mortality assumption, and there may be some pressure to incorporate that new table when. It probably, if we do it something like every 3 years, it just seems like it's less onerous for users in general, rather than having to update things every single year. But once again, I think it's one of those things we want to monitor and see what if we think that every 2 years makes more sense, or every 4 years might make more sense. We'll just keep an eye on it.
Good. So, with great apologies, I have to admit that we're out of time, and we've got a whole ton of really good, interesting questions in the queue, and I'm just sorry we're not going to be able to get to those today, and we'll figure out if there's a way we can address some of these in a public forum so that people can respond to these. We do need to go to that last slide, which has the confirmation code for those who are wanting to get EA credit, and filling that in when you request that. The code is Hawaii, so think summer and warm weather. But at this point, I would like to say thanks to Larry and Bill for presenting, and particularly for the time and effort they put into preparing, but also they represent a group of volunteers as the members of RPEC who've given significant amounts of time over their last, essentially 5 years to see this project through to completion. So we're very grateful to the time and effort they've put into that. Thank you all of you for attending today's webcast. Again, please remember to complete the webcast evaluation, and in order to receive EA credit for this webcast, you must complete the EA Credit Plus form. Both the evaluation and the EA form are available by clicking on the links in your screen. And you should also receive a separate email if you registered for this directly with those links after this webcast. And with that, I'll turn things over to Jen to close out our program.
Great, thank you. Yes, just for that reminder to go to the links box there. The webcast has been identified as qualifying for 1.8 units of EA core credits. You will get the evaluation message sent to you as soon as this is done. Information on how to request EA credit will be in that message. Please note that the deadline for EA credit requests will be Friday, November 14th. To register for any upcoming webcasts or meetings, or to purchase recordings of previous webcasts, please visit www.soa.org today. Thank you for your participation in today's webcast. We hope to see you here again soon. Today's program is copyright 2014 by the Society of Actuaries with all rights reserved. This does conclude today's program. Have a wonderful day, and you may now disconnect.